Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we are going to discuss the 2024 US Open. And we're going to talk about both of the singles champions and finalists on the men's and women's sides, and also some other notable players. But we will have plenty of different themes about some of these different players and the championships relating to the mental side of the game and sports psychology, and we're excited to dive in. So on the women's side, Aryna Sabalenka defeated Jessica Pegula in the finals, 7-5, 7-5. And on the men's side, Jannik Sinner defeated Taylor Fritz, 6-3, 6-4, 7-5. And certainly plenty of themes to talk about. Maybe we could start with some of the women's players and move on to some of the men's players. Brian, wanted to see, maybe where you'd want to get things started in terms of some of the themes. We could start with the finalists potentially as sort of a good starting point, and then go from there. But yeah, take it away.
All right. I'm actually going to start maybe with a crossover theme between the two draws and more
Perfect.
about who wasn't in the final. Meaning Carlos Alcaraz, Iga Swiatek, and Novak Djokovic were players who were not there and lost perhaps earlier than we would expect. And so what is the theme there? To me, watching these players at the U.S. Open, and maybe with respect to Alcaraz, even in Cincinnati, and Swiatek maybe earlier, it would appear to me that, some real physical and mental exhaustion played a part in their performances. Alcaraz at Cincinnati, people are probably familiar with this or have seen it. He broke a racket. He never does something like that. And as he was talking about it, he felt like he wasn't even in control of his body and didn't know what he was doing. And those are, to me, Josh, the statements of someone who is tired, is not really sure what they're doing out there anymore and needs a break. And so to me, I was not surprised with his early exit at the US Open, given what had happened in Cincinnati. Similarly with Novak, I wasn't surprised that he also lost early. I'd watched his first couple of matches and he just didn't look like Novak Djokovic. The game looked off. His energy looked off. He, in fact, looked exhausted in the second set of his first round match. And I was wondering if he's even going to make it here. And then, like I said, with Iga, what was telling me about her, maybe, mental exhaustion or some burnout there is that she's making errors on neutral balls, right? Or even in control of the point and just missing wide when she court's wide open. And so I think this just highlights at how difficult it is to be a professional tennis player, especially when you're at the top of the rankings, but also how demanding that schedule is. Because even Jessica Pegula, who did make the final, obviously, she noted that at the beginning of the year, she was feeling really burned out and was struggling. So I think this is something that players have to deal with. It's a hard part of being a pro, and certainly the Olympics being in between Wimbledon and the US Open most likely did not help Alcaraz and Djokovic. They both reached the final of that event. They both put a lot into that event emotionally. I remember Alcaraz talking about how disappointed he felt about not bringing home a goal to Spain and how he felt the whole country was let down by that. Novak obviously wanting to win that gold medal and putting so much into that. To me, not surprising. And of course, Swiatek played the Olympics as well and was upset there by the eventual champion. So I don't know what you think about that, Josh. Do you think some of that mental and physical tiredness may have played a part with those players?
I absolutely agree. I mean, we've talked on this podcast before about the great toll, the great physical and mental toll that professional players uh, experience on a year-to-year basis, right? That's, I think if we compare tennis to other professional sports, I'm pretty sure it's the shortest off season, or at least pretty close to the shortest off season. I mean, for most of them, they play all the way through, October certainly, and then part of November. And then yes, they have much of December to unwind and maybe rest and recover, heal their injuries, maybe do some strength and conditioning, and then they just start again. And it's a grind to say the least. And then this year they add, it's the Olympics are every 4 years, and it's not just one more tournament. It's a tournament that a lot of players really valued and really put a lot into, as you mentioned, both I think emotionally, but also physically. I mean, I think one significant change about it as well is the change of surface. Players are very used to the schedule where, um, let's say around springtime, they head to Europe for the start of the clay season. They play a lot on clay, culminating in Roland Garros. Then they move over to grass. It's a short grass season, but then they play at Wimbledon, and then they head onto the hard courts. Where this year they went from clay to grass, back to clay, and then to hard courts. So first of all, they're switching surfaces again, an additional time, and not really giving themselves enough time to rest and recover after Wimbledon before gearing up for another Grand Slam, sort of
Yeah.
going
And you have
straight.
some mandatory events in there too, right? That make it more complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah, those Masters tournaments, absolutely. So, yeah, they're, gearing up for from one big tournament, one big event to another really without ever giving themselves time to rest and recover. So, no, I absolutely agree, and I think that's evident with all three of them. I mean, yeah, Iga certainly a big surprise that she lost her semifinal match to Zhang at at her favorite court at Roland Garros. And then yeah, with you know seeing her lose to Jessica Pegula, which was certainly an upset, and then seeing both Alcaraz and Djokovic lose pretty early for both of their standards, second and third round, was you know was surprising to say the least, but I think we can absolutely draw that line from just the exhaustion of the season and the Olympics and all of that sort of um, compounding. And yeah, it can certainly take a toll, and it seems to have really made a difference for them.
And certainly on the men's side, it really opened up the draw for players like Francis Tiafoe and Taylor Fritz and to take advantage of that. But I think what we also see from the two champions is they're both repeat winners of Grand Slams now. And we're seeing some real locker room power, especially for Jannik Sinner. He is definitely the player of the moment, and he's playing some of the best tennis. And Sabalenka, she obviously went through some difficult things this year, injury, tragedy, but came into this tournament, looking like she's playing well, and she established herself as one of the better players, of course, on the tour. Um, so again, maybe establishing some locker room power with her game as well. So I thought that, you had mentioned that in the pre kind of recording prep here that, locker room power really coming out with these players. I'm wondering if you have a comment about that.
I think it's true with both of the finalists, both of the champions, Sabalenka and Sinner. I think um, both of them have really over these past couple of years really just I think both of their games have matured quite a bit. Sinner winning his first Grand Slam in Australia and now his second here, and Sabalenka winning her second slam this January in Australia and her third here. And I think both have really demonstrated themselves to be consistent in different ways. I mean, I think, both are very big hitters, to say the least, very aggressive, very big hitters, but have gotten more consistent and steady with their games. And I think Sabalenka, I don't think this was ever necessarily an issue with Sinner in terms of emotionally being more on the erratic side, but with Sabalenka, that was definitely the case, and I think she's made a lot of strides with that. Where you'll see ups and downs, and she's able to I'd say, sort of ride those waves rather than letting it completely destroy her. I mean, we were talking before we started recording, but in the final against Jessica Pegula in the second set, she started up 3-love, then went to 3-5, and then won it 7-5. So just to be able to see how those swings happen, and they certainly happen, maybe a little bit more so on the women's side, where maybe on the men's side there's a little more dominance with the serve. But just her being able to navigate those and ultimately come out on top, and really just assert her dominance, use that locker room power that she's built and that Sinner has built. And I think both of them being able to, yeah, I think both of them being victorious, I think that, sort of that reputation that they have and that confidence that comes along with that had a lot to do with it.
Sabalenka, as you noted, Josh, yeah, a little bit more emotional between points. But I think she really learned from the experience of last year's final against Coco Gauff, how to deal with it better. And she noted in one of her press conferences that it's really important for her not to be careful in those moments. She said when she gets careful, the ball starts flying all over the place because she's not, accelerating through the ball anymore. So it's really important for her to hit through these wobbles and to find her game again. And I think she did that both against Navarro as well as Pegula in the final. So yeah, I think great lesson learned on her part. I'm sure she'll continue to work on how she deals with those wobbles and some of the facial expressions in the body language between points. Doesn't necessarily help her, probably hurts her a little bit to a certain extent, but she's managing that. I think the thing I really like about Sinner, if we think about a guy who could be a great model for what he's doing between points, it's Jannik Sinner. The energy is always really productive and more or less positive. When he wins something, it's just a very simple fist pump. There's no real screaming or over the top type of stuff. And if he loses a point, it's pretty much go back to the towel, wipe off, and begin again. And then he does that. And I think you noted, these last couple of years, what's he improved? He's improved his serve. He's improved his athleticism and his movement around the court. Somebody even described him as one of the better movers on the court. Now,
I would
think
agree.
2 or 3 years ago, you would not have said that.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't strong enough to do that. And I think it's that level of professionalism and the ball quality that makes him a hard guy to play, because he's not giving you a lot on that emotional side. He's always looking like he's ready, and he's going to keep coming and coming and coming. And so got to give him a lot of credit. And I think the other thing with him is, we're not going to necessarily provide any opinions about the whole doping thing, but it was there. It could have been a huge distraction, but he and his team really got close on that. And he mentioned how important it was for him to just kind of stick with his team and people who believed in him, and to use the power of the team to get through that potential distraction. What other people were saying were simply opinions. People are allowed to have opinions, but For Jannik, it's about going out and doing what the mission of the playing in this tournament was to win. And that's what we're doing. And we're focusing on what we can control. So I think that could have been a tough distraction for him, but kudos to him and his team for dealing with that in a way that allowed him to more or less get through this draw pretty comfortably.
Yeah. Yeah. I think his closest match was his match against Medvedev.
Yeah.
Those I think at the time where they played each other, it was the quarterfinals. They were the only two former Grand Slam champions on the men's side. So yeah, I think you bring up a really important point because you talked about with Sabalenka, she's been through a lot. And I think it certainly took a toll. How could it not? And I think months later, here she is at the top of the game, having won the U.S. Open. But with Sinner, it was different, right? This scandal, this situation came out pretty much right before the U.S. Open. He was asked about it during press conferences. You saw other pro players talking about it, whether it was fair, whether it wasn't fair. And that can all be quite a distraction. That can all be, yeah, I think that can be distracting. That can easily get in your head. That can take you away from you focusing on what's most important, your game, and what you need to focus on if you're going to have a chance to win a Grand Slam. So kudos to him for managing that, handling it, and focusing on what he needed to. And Brian, you brought up his body language, and I think something about him that he does really well is he doesn't show the negative side, but when he wins points, I think he's gotten a lot better at showing some positive energy. He'll be fist pumping towards his team. He'll show off more of that positive energy now than in the past. So I think that's something that everyone has their own style, right? People have different personalities, different temperaments, and I don't, Brian and I certainly aren't saying that everyone needs to play the same way or have the same sort of demeanor out there. But I think if you're going to be on the maybe not on the a little bit, let's say more on the Federer side of not having huge swings up and down. You want to make sure, and being a little bit more stoic, a little bit more Bjorn Borg, like you could say, being able to still have that positive energy when you win a point, still being able to get your box involved, your coach, your team involved, and maybe the crowd as well. I think is really key. I mean, I think the other thing we haven't mentioned this yet is both of the champions faced Americans. Faced Americans, at the U.S. Open, and that's never easy. Never easy when the vast majority of the crowd is rooting against you. We've seen other champions handle this well. Like Djokovic has talked about how when he played Federer, that he visualized the crowd chanting his name instead of Federer's name. But in general, when you're facing an American at the U.S. Open, or um, when your opponent has home court advantage, we could say, it's tough. So, yeah, I think that piece hasn't come up yet. I mean, obviously exciting in other ways, on the men's side, the first Grand Slam finalist that's, an American man in, I believe, 15 years. So that's a big deal. But yeah, I think also, not only did they handle other situations that came up either, earlier this year, but the fact that they handled that particular piece of their environment, I think is quite impressive for both of them.
Yeah, and it was probably important for Sabalenka and Sinner not to go the distance in those matches. Getting it done in straight sets makes it a much easier thing. And I think Sinner was probably more able to keep the crowd at bay, maybe more so than Sabalenka, but in that second set. But yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And I think that's one thing Sabalenka obviously learned from the previous year is to deal with that. In fact, kind of joking around with the crowd, offering to buy them drinks if they cheer for her, just shows, the perspective and the humor that she has to try to bring to that whole thing. And I'm sure that helped her in the moment to understand. Yes, they're going to root for my opponent, but you know what? I'm here, and I can also make light of the situation. I expect it to happen, so I'm not fighting it so much. I'm accepting that this is the way it is, and I'm sure Jannik Sinner also used that sort of acceptance piece to the, yeah, of course they're going to be rooting for Taylor Fritz or celebrities everywhere. It makes sense. You know, my job is to make sure that they don't have a good time while they're watching this match, right? So both of them took care of business in that regard. And like you said, Josh, that's a tough challenge at the U.S. Open.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So no, kudos to them. Yeah, I think there are some other players we could definitely talk about. I mean, I think one theme, or I think one thing that's notable is for both Fritz and Pegula, they both made it to their first final, but it was also their first semifinal because they had each lost in the quarterfinal stage of Grand Slams a number of times for each of them. And you see this with other players, sort of sort of unfortunate streaks of maybe not being able to break through and get past a certain round in a slam. And that was the case for each of them up until this point. So I think that's, sometimes it's almost like that mental hurdle of getting through, yeah, of sort of getting to that point. And both of them earned it, right? I mean, Pegula beating Muhova, Swiatek, Fritz beating Tiafoe, who we can talk more about, beating Zverev, beating Rude. So yeah, I think sometimes it's interesting where a player breaks through, gets to, let's say, their first final, first semifinal, and they use that as sort of a launching pad, and that seems to really propel them. And other times, not so much. So it'll be definitely interesting to see what happens, let's say, over this next year or two with each of them.
Yeah.
I know there are definitely some themes from that Fritz and Tiafoe semifinal. I know we had spoken a little bit earlier. Curious if there's anything that you'd want to bring up about either of them.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, you just to go on sort of the career arc, I think Taylor Fritz has, continued to progress in his career. Um, Maybe it's steady. Maybe he's not super, he's not jumping into the top 10 and staying there, but he's maintaining his ranking, maybe slowly creeping up. And I think that's okay. He's not, bouncing up and down in the rankings. I think maybe Frances Tiafoe tends to do that a little bit more. Not quite as consistent throughout the year, but I think Taylor Fritz has been. I think he's shown some growth. I think so it'll be interesting to see where he goes, Josh, with this. Is this something that will allow him to reach more semis and finals, or are we looking at a player who took advantage of an opportunity, basically what was in front of him from the draw? He did have some good wins for sure. But no Alcaraz, no Djokovic, hard to say if this is what happens, right? But there was a moment I did want to talk about the Tiafoe Fritz match because there was a moment in the second set, beginning of the second set, and maybe let's set the stage a little bit. Going into this match, Frances Tiafoe is 1-6 against Taylor Fritz. The last time he beat him was 8 years ago. Now he's won some sets here and there, but hasn't beaten him in 8 years. So he won their first matchup and he lost the next 6, now until the next 7. And so Tiafoe wins the first set. And like you said, Josh, we did an episode a long, long time ago about the stages of match. And one of the critical stages of match is the beginning of the second set. Whether you won the first or lost it, it's really critical. And so I'm watching this match. Tiafoe has won the first set. And as they're beginning in the second set and Fritz is serving, Tiafoe appears to be letting Fritz win his service games. A couple of times, yes, Fritz was up 40-love, but he would hit a return, Fritz would hit a shot, and Tiafoe is not even trying for it. He's just walking to the chair. And I was baffled. And this happened probably in the first three games of Fritz's serves in the second set. And I'm baffled by this, Josh, because when you're up a set, you've got this guy in an uncomfortable position. Now, all of a sudden, you're letting him basically have love holds through the first half of the set, letting him become more comfortable into the match. I can understand maybe you want to just get to 4-all and see what happens, but that's a risky play. I would have really preferred Francis to really put the screws to Fritz early in that second set, make him really work hard and earn it, and keep him uncomfortable with the scoreboard. And I don't think he did that. And you read the press conference stuff, and Francis is talking a lot about the fourth set and his body giving up on him. And I felt like, dude, if he had taken care of business in the second set, maybe you don't even need to be in a fourth. Maybe you could have put this away. So I thought that, obviously I'm not a part of that performance team, but I just thought that was a mindset or a tactical mistake at the beginning of the second set. And I know, Josh, you said you hadn't necessarily seen that part of it, but I'm just curious what you think of what I'm saying.
I think it's a great point, and I think it's easy to look back at a five setter and for the attention to go to the end of the fourth set into the fifth set. And Tiafoe's body seemed to break down, and he actually talked about that being potentially mental, in terms of him sort of feeling the pressure during those moments, even getting ahead of himself, thinking about being in the final, things like that, and potentially similar, actually, a little bit to what Alcaraz had experienced against Djokovic, where his body completely let him down, and he was cramping, and ended up losing those couple sets, 6-1, 6-1. But yeah, I think you bring up a really important point, because you mentioned that the beginning of a second set is critical. And I think that is absolutely true. And I think, let's say you win the first set. The beginning of a second set is your opportunity, and I use that word intentionally, but it's your opportunity to really try to cement that lead, to really try to put your foot down, really try to build a lead in the beginning of the second set. And then you're up, let's say, a set and a break, and you are firmly in control. What can also happen is your opponent gets off to an early lead. And then, well, yes, you're up your set, but you have to fight back in that second set. And obviously the same is true in reverse, right? You lose a first set. The difference between getting a good start in the beginning of a second set and falling behind in the beginning of the second set can't be overstated. So no, I agree. I think it's, when you, especially at a big moment like a Grand Slam semifinal, but in general, for people that are listening, whether you win or lose a first set, recognizing how important the beginning of that next set is, and having a sense of urgency that wasn't there. That wasn't there with Tiafoe in the beginning of that set. And again, easy to point to, the fifth set, body gave out, and that is true, and that's fair. But the difference between being a set up and sort of battling in a second set, and potentially being able to, through that urgency, through that intensity, potentially be able to take a second set and take a 2-set to love lead is just a huge difference. And could have certainly been one of the factors in terms of why the result was the way that it was.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Again, we'll never know, but I just felt like in the moment, an interesting decision about how to approach that. And I think there's a big difference between, you're up 2 sets to love against a guy, again, that you have lost to 6 times in a row. And I think you could objectively say is currently a better player. And you beating him is an upset. Even if it is the US Open and you do well there, it's still probably an upset, because he's an American too. And he likes playing there just as much as you do. And so, 2 sets up versus 1 set all. I don't know. I think you'd much rather be 2 sets up. It's obvious, but it's not how it went. And interesting to know if it's a mental thing. You wouldn't expect a player who's as physical and strong as Francis Tiafoe to necessarily break down. But like you said, maybe like Alcaraz against Djokovic. Of course, that happened much earlier. That was like at the beginning of the second set, right? That's how tight
Yep.
Alcaraz was. Um, but this was a little bit different. So, what are your thoughts on Taylor Fritz's, progress and career arc? And his potential. And we also, you know what, Josh, we haven't even said a word about Jack Draper,
That's a
the
good
other
point.
semifinalist.
Yeah, and very deserving of yeah, of recognition. Um, I mean, to get to address both of those points, with Fritz, yeah, I mean, he's a highly touted junior. I know he won a junior Grand Slam. Was it Junior U.S. Open, perhaps? I think it was Junior U.S. Open. I know that actually a few of the young Americans, both Opelka, who I believe won Wimbledon, Junior Wimbledon, Fritz, and then I think Tommy Paul had won the Junior French Open. So Fritz was certainly a highly touted junior. Has had a lot of success and sort of seemed to break through a couple years back, winning Indian Wells. And his ranking, I think, it peaked at number 5 in the world. And then, it has been sort of cemented himself as the number 1 American for the vast majority of the last few years. And I would say the most consistent. I'd say the most consistent one. Um, but has seemed to get in his own way. And some maybe not even get in his own way, but has sort of has fallen at the same hurdle in terms of that quarterfinal stage and has just not necessarily, managed to beat the top guys in the world. I remember a match, I think it was a 5-setter at Wimbledon where he lost to an injured Nadal, and he's had some tough battles. But yeah, I think the fact that he has seemed to have put his head down, gotten to work, worked on different aspects of his game. And I think, I think he just seems like a more well-rounded player now. In the past, I think he was, he's always had a great serve. He's always had a good big forehand and been a powerful player, but I think just is definitely a more well-rounded player, mixing in more variety, things like that. And I think, I think it seems like he's learned from his experience. So definitely kudos to him on all that. In terms of Jack Draper has also been a player who, he's a younger player, has had a lot of attention on him. I think people, I think that people have sort of viewed him as the next British star, and I think there have been different cases in the past where the next up and coming British star or French star or American star or Australian star. And maybe there's something to do with pressure actually tied to hosting the Grand Slams in some way, but or even just the tennis history of some of these countries. But I think sometimes in the past that has led to tabloids and press jumping on people, putting inordinate amount of pressure on people. And I think, Draper has been seen as sort of the next big thing in British tennis for a while. And has had a lot of great success. Has also had a lot of injuries. I know he talked about last year watching the US Open from home, and his ranking had I think dropped outside of the top 100. So, he's had also his fair share of controversies recently for people that saw the match point with Felix Auger-Aliassime, which very much seemed to be unintentional, that he didn't realize it, but he also got a lot of negative publicity about that. And yeah, for him to be able to break through, I think he hadn't lost a set before the semifinal where he ended up losing. And he also seemed sick. I know he vomited on the court, and just unfortunate to maybe not be feeling your best in the biggest match of your life. But yeah, I think if he could manage to stay healthy, he's gonna be really tough. He has a big lefty game, really great serve. He seems to be a fighter. So I think yeah, I think this could absolutely be his breakthrough run. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what he can do to follow it up for the rest of the year now.
He's always struck me as a great ball striker. And previous to this tournament, or maybe even previous to the summer, but somebody who makes not the best decisions and makes a lot of errors. And maybe he's tightened that up. The fact that he went through this tournament up until the semifinal without losing a set tells you that he probably has done a good job of that. I think you bring up a good point, though, about him being a British player. I mean, there's something about the British press that is different than other countries, and they do tend to have people on pedestals, and they really love tearing them down. Or when they don't win, they put so much pressure. Even if you just look at how they write and talk about their soccer team, their national football team, it's brutal how they treat these athletes. And I hope that Jack has a good team around him to deal with that. We see a little bit of that with Emma Raducanu, of course, right? She won the U.S. Open a few years ago, and now every time she steps on the court, there are these massive expectations from the British press and the British public about what she's going to do, and it's really hard for a young player to deal with that. And so Jack hopefully can figure that out because he, like you said, Josh, he's got a great lefty game, hits a big ball. He's very strong and athletic if he can stay healthy, and he could be, but one tournament does not make a player. And we have to see kind of repeated performances here before we can start anointing anybody as the next great thing. So I think Jack has work to do the rest of the year and into next year to show us that this is him, or, versus I had a great couple of weeks and now I've kind of come back to my normal set point, because that can happen. We've seen that happen many, many times. But, exciting to see somebody different there. And well, I guess we'll just see what happens in the next year or so.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we've seen other players break through win tournaments, get to the semifinals of a slam, things like that, and not follow it up as much. So
yeah, it tends to happen, I think, a little bit maybe more on the women's side than the men's. You see a little bit more of that, but especially with the big three, this is the first year, since 2002, that one of those three players did not win a Grand Slam. I mean, that does tell you that there aren't that many one-offs on the men's side. There are few, but I think you see more on the women's side.
No, that's definitely true. And I think, I think we should actually talk a little bit about, speaking of the women's side, Coco, who it was the champion last year and, lost, I think, probably earlier than she would have wanted against Navarro. And, I think even leading up to the tournament just hadn't been, maybe at her best in recent months, recent tournaments. So curious if you had any thoughts about her.
Well, I'm curious also what you think about this, but I feel when people are talking about Coco, they're talking always about her deficits or supposed deficits. They're talking about her serve. They're talking about her forehand. They're not talking about, what she's really good at. I mean, she won the U.S. Open last year really on a lot of grit and heart, working through the serve and the forehand stuff. And I just wonder, is she hearing too much about her own deficits and not enough about what she's great at? Because you don't become a champion who can repeat titles by fixing problems, right? Or fixing weaknesses. Mm-hmm. You become that champion by accepting who you are and really leaning into those strengths. And so again, we're not part of the performance team. We don't have any visibility into that. But every time I hear people talking on ESPN or other programs, it's always about the forehand and the serve, the forehand and the serve. And how, is she hearing that too much? Because what broke down, especially against Navarro, was the serve. I'm not sure how many double faults there were in that third set, but there were a lot of double faults. Basically, just gave away the match. Navarro didn't have to do a ton to really win that third set. So I don't know what you think of that observation, Josh.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think, we talked about the British press, and I think on the American side, there's interesting dynamics as well, where I think, there have been plenty of great male and female players in the US in recent years. But on the men's side, what's been lacking is a Grand Slam champion. And I think in certain ways, and on the women's side, there's been a number of different Grand Slam champions, but Serena retired a couple years back, and Venus is still out there playing. Kudos to her credit, and into her 40s, but is certainly not the player she once was. So I think I think there is sort of this yearning for the next big thing. And, Coco winning the US Open last year, I think that sort of cemented this thought that she was going to be the next big thing. And then when she hasn't yet followed that up, I think that often comes with a lot of question marks. So I think, sometimes it's these societal questions where the press or coaches or people around her might be talking, in these sorts of ways, and maybe focusing on those perceived weaknesses rather than building up that strength. I mean, her backhand, her movement, her fighting spirit are, as good or better than anybody's on the tour. So, instead of always trying to focus on, the forehand and making changes or serve consistency or whatever it may be, can you make those strengths even better? Can you make them sort of super strengths? I know Brian, you've used that term in the past, but I think it's accurate, right? Where if we think about a Serena, if we think about a Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, yes, they have aspects of their game that are weaker, but we don't think about them. We their identity is tied to the strengths of their game. So I think that's something that certainly the media and everything could do better with, but also, that could be important for her going forward. And I think it's important for everybody, right? The more that we can, the more that everybody can try to see their own games through their strengths, try to build up their strengths rather than it being always about these deficits in their game and what we're doing wrong and what we need to do better with. Yes, there's a piece of that does have truth in terms of we should always try to be striving to be better, and we don't want to have too many vulnerabilities in our game. But if we're always focusing on those pieces, then we're not doing enough to build up the strengths that we already have that can ultimately be the difference maker in terms of us, of who ends up winning a title, right? It's not the player that wins the title is not the player that just doesn't have any weaknesses. It's often the player that is able to, to really dominate and win and do that because of what they are bringing to the table rather than what they're missing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that one of her coaches is basically a TV star and will go on ESPN and talk about her. And to me, I don't know, there's a fine line there, but perhaps ethically about, is that something you should really be doing?
Yeah.
If she's okay with it, that's okay. But it's an American coach talking to an American audience about an American player, right? Because you could say the same thing with Darren Cahill and Jannik Sinner, but Darren Cahill is not doing commentary for Italian television, and Jannik Sinner probably doesn't watch a ton of ESPN, and they care less about that, right? So, yeah, so I think that's another interesting dynamic. You have this coach who also goes and talks about you on TV, and then they ask him about it, and he's okay with answering questions on that topic. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what happens with her, because I think this tournament and as well as Wimbledon, not great. And also, kind of on the mental side as well. So maybe she's another one who needs some time off. Maybe there is some tiredness or exhaustion there. But who knows? It'd be great to see her come back to the level that she was showing, the summer of 2023.
Yeah, and I think also from a pressure standpoint, I mean, first of all, the pressure of trying to follow up your first Grand Slam. So, certain pressure here, defending her title at the US Open, also ranking pressure. She'd been up as high as number 2 in the world, went to number 3, and Sabalenka became number 2. And then, after this tournament, I think she's down to 7, if I recall. So there's ranking pressure. Even at the Olympics, there was significant pressure. She had been named the one of the 2 U.S. flag bearers for the Olympics, standing next to LeBron James. The two of them being essentially representing the U.S. team. So, I think that obviously leads to a lot of eyeballs on you and a lot of pressure as well. So, it could also be, I mean, I think we can't forget how young she is. And, she really has her whole career in front of her, even though she burst onto the scene at 14, 15, beating highly ranked players. She still is just so young. And I think we need to remember, I think everyone needs to remember that she still has plenty of time to develop and grow and improve. So yeah, we'll see what happens there, but certainly wouldn't surprise me if she's able to put this behind her and win many Grand Slams going forward.
Yeah, and obviously we hope the best for all the players. And that they continue to improve and work on their mental games, get the necessary rest and help that they need, because it just makes the sport so much better when people are feeling good and playing well. And of course, there were some great stories from this U.S. Open. So thanks, Josh, for a good discussion, good recap of some of the mental themes that we saw, sports psychology themes we saw from the 2024 U.S. Open. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.